be here with you. We're going to get things kicked off. My name is Andrew Schwartz. I work for the Center for Earth Ethics, and I have the honor of being the convener for this first of 5 dialogues that we are hosting for the Faith and Food Coalition. These dialogues are contributing to the United Nations Food Systems Summit, which is asking people from around the world to contribute their ideas and solutions and ways of being to encounter the deep needs, gaps, and problems within our food systems now and going into the future. So this is an opportunity to bring together some great speakers from around the world to answer the question of not only how do we solve these, but why. We've created these dialogues with a lens for faith and for values to kind of look at the beyond just the mechanistic solves that we need to have, but also looking at the deep cultural, spiritual, traditional values of food, what it means to be a human and to be alive beyond just the simple sake of eating, which some people simply do not have right now. We know that COVID-19 has taken a huge blow to the gains we've made over the past bunch of years to feeding the hungry. And so as we look at this time and this moment, we need to ask, how are we meeting the needs of those who most need food? And how do we do that with an ever increasing population, risk to from climate and so many other complications and problems? So we've gathered together a group of experts in our panel who come at this issue of food from different directions. We've made these panels intentionally intersectional, interfaith, and across sector, who all in each of these people are addressing the food system from a different perspective. And that's the point, because there's no single solution to this. We need to be working together. We need to bring the best of what each of us has to offer, the best of each of our perspectives, and say, how do we do this together? How do we learn from one another? How do we listen? How do we learn, and how do we solve? It's not always going to be easy. We probably won't all agree all the time, and that's okay. That's important. It's the diversity of our perspectives and our solutions and our strengths that are going to get us there. And so with that, I'm going to take a second to introduce each one of the panelists, and then I'll introduce our moderator, and we'll get things underway. So first, I want to excuse me, introduce Chef Kabui, who is an internationally celebrated organic chef, food strategist, an urban farmer, and food activist. He is an African food ambassador with multiple projects underway in Kenya, including the Organic Chef Farms and a demonstration farm to help simulate the local economy and planting trees to stem the impacts of climate change. Chef, welcome. Next, I want to introduce Denisa Livingston. She is a leading Dene community health advocate and the Slow Food International Indigenous Counselor of the Global North. She is an organizer for the Dene Advocacy Community Alliance. Denisa, thank you so much for being here. Tambra Stevenson is the founder and CEO of WANDA, which stands for Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture, which is building a supportive sisterhood for the African diaspora. We're so glad that you're here, Tambra. Next is Ajay Verjakar. He is a citrus farmer based in Punjab, India. He is the chairman of Bharat Krishak Samaj, which is a farmers forum in India. It's a non-political, non-sectarian association of farmers advocating for farmer prosperity. He's also working as the vice chair of Action Track 2. So I'm very excited to be able to create a little communication between the different tracks here. And then we have Professor Cheryl Hendricks, and she's the head of department and professor in the Department of Agriculture, Economics, Extension, and Rural Development at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, where she also serves as the director for the Institute of Food, Nutrition, and Wellbeing. So thank you so much for being here, you all. And lastly, happy to introduce our moderator, who is Bibi La Luz Gonzalez. based in Guatemala. She's an international political economist, working in food security, climate, sustainability, and human rights. She is the founder of Eat Better Waik and our moderator. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Bibi.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for the super warm introduction. And welcome to all the audience. Thank you for being here, either if it's morning, afternoon, or evening. As you see, we have a panel from all over the world, and I love this diversity of different perspectives, but working towards a same purpose, which is achieving the most dignified way of life through food, and the people who populate this earth, of how we can understand our way of living starting with food. So to give out this brief introduction, we'll have an hour and a half, and you will be able to make your questions as we go. You can put them on the chat, and then we have a special time allocated to answer more specific questions. And we appreciate your time here and hoping we can learn so much. And this is a very important session because it is the first one of the 5 series parts of Faith and Food. So it's especially special to be here today, and can't wait to get so much out of this. And also what I am very much looking forward is connecting exactly that faith with food. So I congratulate the coalition, the Interfaith Coalition, for making this happen as well. And it's also been a learning process for me to connect that faith perspective with the food security, climate, and human rights that I put in practice. So coming not from a religious background, although I do have faith, it has been an enlightening part. And that comes also with my name. My name is Bibi La Luz, which La Luz in Spanish means the light. So I think everything is super interconnected and intertwined. And let's see how we connect the dots today. So with that said, we're going to start off with Chef Kabui. And I will make a general first question for each and every one of you. So we will start with Chef Kabui, then Tambra, Denisa, Ajay, and Cheryl, and then a second one that will go on the reverse order. So let's see how we can also connect what everyone else is saying to your work and have these actions and commitments ready, and for the audience to be super participative as well and bring your perspectives too. So with that, I am going to start. First, we need to understand where we're positioned. This is the first dialogue, which focuses on Action Track 1 of the United Nations Food Systems Summit, which is to ensure access to safe and nutritious food for all. When I read this, I correlated with SDG 2, which talks about this as well, and ending all forms of malnutrition. So considering the daunting components of Action Track 1 to meet SDG 2, that also has some sort of connection with SDG 3 and 12 of ending hunger, reduce malnutrition, to reduce the incidence of non-communicable diseases, to ensure access to safe and affordable nutritious food in a sustained way. Chef Kabui, what would be your game-changing solution, or what is your game-changing solution to meet these goals and overcome the systemic barriers in food system in your own locality? If we can unmute.
Thank you so very much, Bibi, and for all the other panelists, for our listeners, and especially for Earth Ethics for putting this event together. It's a great pleasure to offer a few of my ideas. My game changing, if I have one, is that I am of the opinion that being literate and being responsible of our individual role in dealing with the major crises that we face of climate change, of global warming, of health, of opportunities for young people, of issues of justice, human rights, all would have to start from our own individual actions. It's easy to look at the colony of bees or to look at the ocean, but yet it's single drops that all add up to eventually make up a sea. So that's how I see the problem as well as the solution. The problem, there's one author or one writer who was a very good friend of Dr. Martin Luther King. And he was one of his advisors. But what he said is that very few are responsible for the problem. No, very few are guilty of the problem. The problem it only takes a few people to blow up the house. But it's our all of our responsibility to build the house back together. This earth is our house. It's broken, and it will take all of us to bring the house back together because our life depends on it. So my game changer is that we all have to start by being responsible. And food is the one thing that we change. Food can change so many things at the same time. It's very, very difficult in this world to do just one thing. If you go and steal someone, if you go and cut a tree, it's not just a tree that you cut, but it disturbs the whole ecosystem. In the same sense, I think that if we change the way we eat, we can bring about the greatest amount of good if we eat good. And that's my position.
And what would be your suggestion, and maybe perhaps what you are doing as a chef, that you prepare food and also take into consideration the ingredients that you have, and maybe perhaps an experience, because food gets people together. It's some sort of community, a trusted one. How are you making that happen? What would you suggest that we need to change the way of the food that we eat? What would be that food?
Yeah, thank you so very much, Bibi, again. Very wonderful question. That question gets at the heart of why and what I do, why I do what I do. First, I start by what I proposed in the previous statement, that taking responsibility. I know a chef is a very, very influential person in society. So I belong in, to have the role of a chef is to carry a very, very big burden, but also to have a very, very great opportunity. Just simply when I wear a white coat, people treat me very, very differently than they typically do if I don't have a white coat, if people don't think I'm a chef. So that's number one. What is the challenge that I step into? I step into the challenge of being a chef by first accepting the responsibility of the history of the discipline of chefs. Chefs traditionally just prepared food for the royal family. You know, the tradition that we know of culinary now comes from Italy, mainly in France. And in Italy and France, before the French Revolution, the chefs did not prepare food for the common man. They only prepared food for the rich, for the wealthy and the super wealthy, the 1 of 1% of those days. But after the French Revolution, or let me say that during that time, they were preparing food not for health, not for sustainability, but for opulence and for the display of the wealth of the kings and how they were, and that was indicative of the oppressive system that was going on at that time. So when the French Revolution happened and the Queen Antoinette and Ferdinand was beheaded, then the idea of chefs cooking for the king ended. So they had to cook for the regular people. So the final thing I want to say is that when the chefs were cooking for the kings, there were illnesses and lifestyle diseases that came up as a result of the kind of food that the chefs were cooking. When those diseases in those days were not common to the regular people. But when the chefs started cooking for the regular people, What they essentially did, either by intent or not, what eventually happened is that the same lifestyle diseases that the 1%, 1% was suffering, now those diseases became common for the regular people. So chefs have a very big responsibility in the broken food system that we have. So that's why I start. So how do I fix that? I fix that by creating my own cuisine. I call Afrofuturistic conscious cuisine. Cuisine that is very, very intentional, is very, very false, is very rooted in who I am, right? And then because part of oppression has to do with the alienation. So first of all, I have to take responsibility for who I am. I'm an African, I'm a Black person, and I'm living under a systemic racist a global system. So I started, and that's what my solution is. So come up with a food that is very intentional, with a very, very focus in everything I do, how I grow the food, how I prepare the food, how I serve the food, how I share the food, and the message that I deliver through food.
That is brilliant. Thank you so much, Chef Kabui. It's been enlightening, and you've touched so many aspects from history to now, and for sure that opulence and creates that disparity, and we still see today a lot of inequality. Thank you so much, and we'll go on to Tambra, and this is a super great cue from Chef Kabui, speaking from that perspective, right, where he's from, really getting on those basic, I mean, where you're from, the community, and the systemic, let's say, racism that exists still, and that is also regarding food and also women. So Tambra, please tell us more. What is your game-changing solution to overcome the systemic barriers in your locality?
Thank you so much, Bibi, and thank you, Chef Kabui, who I've known for quite some time. We are definitely brothers and sisters in this food fight for freedom. With that said, though I am now based in Washington, D.C., my roots are very much from the heartland in Oklahoma, where I'm fourth generation Oklahoman. And I share this because our roots lay the foundation of how we build and how we see the world. For me, that I typically describe Oklahoma as the 4S, but I would have to add a fifth one, just because of being in a matriarchal household, that it's faith, it's food, it's football, it's family, but it's also feminine power. And I did not always see the strengths of the roots in which I was nurtured. And it's taken my adulthood and being a mother now of two beautiful children to realize that all we need is already within our community, within our culture, within our identity, within our own divine feminine power. And that really kind of laid the foundation of reflection of who am I, informing WANDA, Women Advancing Nutrition, Dietetics, and Agriculture. Though I grew up in a Protestant household, my biological father followed the Islamic faith, but also became a Catholic with my children now. And I'm very much interfaith. And I connect to also African spirituality and see the common goodness of all religions and faith that speaks to love and one that heals our society for the better. And for me, it's those values, how they are reflected in our food system, that becomes critically important. And it's those values that I have found to lay the foundation of WANDA. And I wanted to just say the game-changing solution for me is values-based leadership. And that is what we need. We must have the courage to lead from within. Being in so many different leadership programs, having worked in federal government, local government, and now serving on our DC Food Policy Council, I find that it is these values that guide and build the courage for us to be bold and audacious and having the internal wherewithal to lead when others will not lead. And it's when we do that is when we are able to change the system, because we changed ourselves. And the values that we're guided by at WANDA is one, committed to the power of changing the trajectory of our communities, caring enough to empower ourselves and our families, conscious enough of the colonial tactics to subvert our communal restoration, and cultivating a power of a healing culture and connected to the power of sisterhood and service, and concerned enough to shift the power in the food system and contributing to a positive impact in our communities and our families, and seeing the power of cooking and writing our recipes as a way to celebrating our heritage. And I say this because when you think about the history of colonization, and I spent my first semester, my PhD program at American University in the School of Communication, writing on food colonialism, going back to the history of how colonialism played out in Western Africa, and how did we come up with things like jollof rice and other dishes that really are colonized cuisine, even soul food. It's not just African American food, it's a mixture of indigenous, European, and African cultures blended together. And how do you begin in this movement of decolonization of our diets, recognize that we have to first decolonize our minds? So there's a process of, as we learn in the Western world, how do we unpack, unlearn, and relearn? And that's the process that I found myself going through, that it's not enough to have representation as we have here. It's also, how are we representing, because we have a renewed mindset in going in. And that's why, for me, it's not enough just to have Black women, but Black women who are part of the process of changing themselves internally in order to change their families. And that will be the same across the board, because we all have been impacted by colonization. This is not an issue of just white people. This is an issue that, how are we navigating these systems of oppression and creating those game-changing solutions, because we have tapped and understood what values are guiding us that allow us to lead from within to without, because so many leadership programs focus on the external. And so that means across the food system, from the research, what research agendas are we setting when it comes to making investments in diverse diets, as well as the policy? How does it not address just a Band-Aid solution, as we see with current legislation, even here in DC right now, in addressing nutrition, that we need to address the structural issues, changing the built environment, investing in the human capital to create more career opportunities in food and nutrition, when we have 2.7% African-American dietitians, nutritionists out of 89,000 nutritionists in this country. That's appalling. If we're truly fighting a food fight for freedom, we need all troops on the ground. Having been a national security scholarship, coming from a military town, that is what we need. And so I'm so very much appreciative of having this platform to dive into these deeper issues and how can we be the change we want to see in the world.
Thank you so much, Tambra. And it's great how you mentioned at the beginning you're being so interfaith. And I loved how you also mentioned how everything is blended in together, of being bold, audacious, and maybe just in 3 words, or what will be your main 3 barriers that you have seen for decolonizing the system and decolonizing the mind? Just very briefly.
Wow, I've really been trying to, I'm the queen of taglines, and I've tried to really think about the one word that kind of summed this up. But I find that we have an issue of internalized like anti-intersectionality or anti-Blackness, anti-womanhood. And I say this, you know, with the thought of how do we honor the room of all people, and that we all value our voices. Some voices should not be deemed more valued than others. And so valuing our humanity, how do we rehumanize people of indigenous African cultures? And that means, how do we rehumanize ourselves? And that becomes reflective in the relationships, how we treat others. If I'm a Black woman and another Black woman prefers to listen to the values and the words of a white woman over me just because of her position in this society, that is a form of internal hate, whether she realizes it or not, and that needs to be unpacked. And that is the work that we do through Wanda about how do we unpack these internalized systems of oppression, how we devalue our own womanhood, our own African culture, in order to show up as our best selves and show all of our assets when the world may see us as a deficit.
Incredibly well said, Tambra. And what you mentioned as well as Indigenous populations, I'm here to ask the question as well to Denisa. You're a champion in food systems, and you work thoroughly for Indigenous populations, also the empowering women too. So Denisa, we would love to hear you as well. What are your game-changing solutions? And it's just, for me right now, I'm just very, very grateful for these moments. And thank you so much for all of your voices today.
Thank you for that. Just like to introduce myself in my Indigenous language in Dene. Yat e bene she Denisa Livingston in Nishia Kilachini Nashlan Tishidina e Bashichin, Ose Dene Tachini Dashache, Donanish Eja Tachini Dashanella, Tayasident Nasha e Tedagon will ya diaquit adi Nishila. I just introduced myself in Dene. I'm from the Red House People Clan. I'm here in New Mexico, southwest area of Turtle Island. And thank you for your question this morning. It has been quite insightful as I'm eager to hear everyone's contributions about this. And some of the game-changing solutions is really coming from our ancestral wisdom and knowledge. And part of that is getting our apron on. And in Indigenous communities, tribal sovereignty is something that we have always been discussing as, colonizations and systems that have been placed upon us has really brought the issue of CRAP, carbonated, refined, artificial processed foods. As my Dene people were sent to a concentration camp by the US government, and that's where salt, sugar, and flour was introduced. And so our work here on the Navajo Nation and around where we are right now is addressing that food apartheid, is addressing the lack of access to healthy food as everything was taken from our elders and our ancestors. And we are trying to restore that. We are trying to recover and address that, the crap. And so it's really important for us as we have passed the Healthy Dene Nation Act of 2014, addressing the unhealthy foods in our area here. And we've raised from an unhealthy foods tax, and it's the only unhealthy foods tax in the US. And it's an Indigenous nation that's leading this work, these policies. And as I have led this work with community members, grassroots community members who have joined together, we have written pieces of legislation and passed policies to be able to address this, because this is the prison food. This is the food that is harming, contaminating our bodies, contributing to nutritional trauma. And as we address this, we really need to be connecting innovation with community members to be able to include their voices at the table. And this is something that is really important as we are urging tribal governments and governments to have social innovators, to have elders and youth at the table to make those decisions. And so for us, the Healthy Dene Nation Act, we have raised over $7.5 million, funding over 1,000 community wellness projects to address the food apartheid, to address the issues in our community, whether it's uranium contamination that is a barrier to our farms and our gardens, whether it's a recycling program, food and water initiatives, whatever our communities need, whether it's in a social or physical environment, that they're able to use that funding. And so as we get our aprons on, bringing tribal sovereignty, bringing sovereignty to the kitchen table and seeing that empowerment at a cellular level is what we're trying to do. And what we're working on is really looking at the Indigenous public health systems. We're creating policies with Indigenous knowledge, with our Indigenous languages, with our Indigenous tribal synergies that we have, and also the intergenerational knowledge that exists, so that we can write the policies that apply and that will work in our communities, rather than having policies placed on us or even for us or spoken on behalf of us without consultation with Indigenous people. And as we address our food systems and the histories and the present reality of what we face now, because we're we're facing what we call unhealthy food in our language, we had to create the term, and the term never existed in our language because we never had unhealthy food. And, we call it Ian Bajol. Ian means food, but Bajol means the scraps, the unhealthy food, the non-nutritious food, the prison food, the crap. It explains all of that. And we never had that word, and we had to create that word. And, more importantly is just focusing on and that is healthy food is life, healthful food is life, returning back to our traditional ways, returning back with the policy, the sister policy that we passed was a tax elimination on healthy food with an emphasis on indigenous foods. And so as we've been working on these policies and really being the lead in these types of actions, it's really important as we address that grandma, she has knowledge, grandpa has knowledge that we cannot find in textbooks. And that's what we're trying to implement, is really finding that way to be able to have that collective continuance of what our ancestors went through, and also steward the way forward about how do we change the food systems, how do we address, what has happened in the past, and also how do we go forward to be able to unite, our communities in this aspect. And especially through the pandemic, we've seen it so importantly now that it's going beyond equity and justice. It's reprogramming our tongue for liberation, because we're dealing with an addiction of unhealthy food. And it's really important as we go through this time to be able to call out what needs to be called out. And it's pretty to talk about food sovereignty, but it's not pretty to talk about the unhealthy food, to talk about big soda, to talk about big chips, big candy. And this is the really important thing and part of the discussion that needs to happen. Yes, it's great to talk about healthy food, but it's really, we have to address the backbone of what's causing all of these other issues. And so for us in our communities, we're reclaiming our food ways and our life ways in as many ways as possible as we can, and trying to create the synergies with our tribal governments, with other tribal nations, and especially across the world, that we can see now the resurgence of indigenous actions. And so I really appreciate this. I get excited about it because it's something that my grandma Jessie, who just turned 90, she's like, you steward the way forward, and you have what it needs. And just like my sister Tambra said, we already have what we need in our hearts and also in our communities to be able to carry the solutions forward. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Denisa. And talking about Ion Bejon, right? It's important, and certain words that you said, Ion Bejon of unhealthy foods. You spoke about the prison that we're in within the food, and our tongue liberation as well. And I just want to mention, really value for the audience, value your ancestors, your grandparents, value what you have that is rich in your land, that will bring you health. Because if you're living, you need to have health in order to live the way you would like to live, I'm assuming, right? And also to your point, Denisa, with the organization that I have, it's in an indigenous Mayan language, which in just 4 words, it means, in Maya Quiche, it means to eat a healthy and nutritious meal. So just put in the words as well of bringing back that too. And it's also, I named it like that, Waik, because of my grandparents, because they're from the land where that those languages are spoken. So really value that. And maybe before we go to Ajay, I just would love to know, you spoke about indigenous food. Can you give us an example of what that would be?
To me, right, Bibi? Okay. Wow, there's so many indigenous foods, many indigenous foods that we see in our grocery stores that, that many people do not know, from berries to, different meats. Where I come from, we have corn, beans, and squash, different varieties. And we have pumpkins, and we have even across Turtle Island, so many different types of indigenous foods, as like buffalo and different types of seafood. And indigenous foods are everywhere. And what I love from where I come from is really the 3-leaf sumac berry. And that is different from what is in the Middle East, and as well as the green thread tea that we have. And so for us, it's a variety of different foods, and the wild foods that are out there now that are coming up, the wild carrots, the wild celery, the wild onions that are coming up. So there's just, plenty of foods that we see everywhere, and it is, in every community that across the world. And so, it's really important, that we recognize what is in our environment, what is where I'm at, that is indigenous. And it's a beautiful journey to see and to taste, and also to remind grandma that we're still making the food that she's making, because she's healing through it. My grandma Jessie, she's healing through it. She remembers experiences as a child, and that's really important for our elders too. So thank you for asking.
Yes, of course, Denisa. And that goes in line with our next panelist, Ajay, because he is a farmer. So he can tell us firsthand how he's growing all these foods, whether indigenous here or there in India. Thank you so much, Ajay, for your time. And considering what Denisa also mentioned, in your field of expertise, what are your game-changing solutions to overcome these barriers? You're in India, so it's huge, but and there are different geographies too. So let us know what can be applicable in your locality, but as well in general other places too.
Thank you for this opportunity. And I just want to say before I start is that living in a joint family, the diets are better. You have more traditional variety of meals and dishes, and that's the real faith. That's where faith begins from. When you have faith in your own family and you live together, and you're fortunate to do that. I will use this opportunity first to define the problem before I come to a game-changing solution, as I see from a farmer's or producer's perspective. After 25 years of ratification of WTO treaties on food and agriculture, every 9th person in the world is sleeping hungry today. And not because there's not enough food, but because food systems have evolved in a way that food, a basic human necessity, has been rendered unaffordable and inaccessible. Not only that, 1/3 of the food is being wasted, and 80% of the world's extremely poor people live in rural communities. And most of those who are chronically hungry are the ones who produce the food to feed the world. And surprisingly, the ones who are obese are the ones who actually buy the food. So there's something drastically wrong with the food systems. And that's exactly what the Food Systems Summit is trying to solve. But the question is, why is it so difficult to end hunger? Why can we not end hunger very fast? Because food is available, and mankind has made immense breakthroughs in innovation and technology. I believe that the food systems are structured today such that rural communities are becoming more and more dependent on markets for nutrition, making them vulnerable to supply side disruptions, price shocks, as has been magnified in the pandemic year. So I personally think, with my experience in my village, on my farm, and I see other farmers, that they're growing less and less nutrition for themselves, but more and more for the markets, and that's creating problems, multiple problems that is being created. So what we need to invest in kitchen gardens, backyard poultry to improve nutrition, to make rural lives more resilient, less prone to market price fluctuations. A home garden can supply a substantial portion of non-staple foods that a family needs, including roots, tubers, vegetables, fruits, legumes, herbs, spices, lots of traditional varieties, lots of traditional food that is not available in the market, and we are not growing it, and we are losing it. We are losing our culture because of it. And so the home gardening and such stuff like backyard poultry and wet community markets, where you can actually take your fresh produce, exchange it, and sell it within the communities, is something that I think needs to be done. But unfortunately, there's not enough research happening on this. It's vastly undocumented. Even FAO has agreed to it in the report, because this is the year of the fruits and vegetables for FAO. Even there, they have said so that it's the impact is largely unknown. So from the farm, from the village, I can say these are the questions we need to do. There's not enough research happening on such low cost solutions which are available. There's agriculture research is also not happening on these traditional varieties of growth or for agroecology. It's really surprising that we are focusing on capital intensive research. Capital papers are coming out on such stuff, and there, like home gardening is a low cost proposition which with no apparent trade-offs or political consequences. So there are many answers why this is not happening, but one of them is that those who influence policy and those who make the policy, the academically trained people, have lived experiences, and so they fail to grasp full impact of these low-cost proposals. I think I'll just leave it at that, and maybe we can elaborate later as we go on.
That is, wow, fantastic. And thank you so much for providing us all the data as well. But I think people don't, there's just so much data around that is sometimes difficult to just focus on this one. And I just, since we have Cheryl and she will be answering our next question. She's an academic and she'll tell us more about that. But what do you feel that researchers and academics would have to do in order to go in line to the policies that are being crafted on another level?
So I think so there is lack of representation and equity in the research system. Recently, Professor Arvind Subramaniam and Devesh Kapoor came up with a paper where they published a paper which clearly articulated that 7% of those authoring conference papers for, let's say, World Bank's annual bank conference on development economics are from the developing world. Only 7%, and that's an example to say that there's not even research on equity. There's not enough equity on research that is happening. And deep down, I think there is a correlation between constant failure to make food systems more equitable and the academic research and agriculture research, which is focused on food value chains, invariably controlled by big businesses.
Thank you so much, Ajay. Wow, I am even thinking of, you mentioned education, learnings, and I want to ask Cheryl as well, of course, in addition to what are your game-changing solutions to this, what would you answer Ajay about the academic part? For example, is any university, because when we spoke, I want her to be my PhD advisor. So much that we were in line, and that goes with the academic part too, and then to put it into practice. But for example, Ajay spoke about kitchen gardens. Are there being taught something like that? Are students also being empowered? And in that sense of education, academic research from academic institutions and women like you as well, if we want to talk about equity, we need to speak about women too. Then what are your game-changing solutions for this system that has been, as Ajay say, drastically wrong?
Thank you. You've set a big task for me. To me, the game changer is actually this conversation and the summit itself. I think the whole framing of food systems provides us with something we've never had before. So previous summits have been driven by a small group of people who draft a memo, and that becomes the declaration. Whereas this summit, and boosted by the inconvenience of COVID and the fact that people can't get together in Rome to plot that particular summit declaration, has meant that people all over the world are able to gain access to so much more of the discussions, the inputs, and thinking about these issues. So for the first time, you see, especially in Action Track 1, you see inequalities, nutrition, food security, and agriculture coming together, which never, because even if you look in academic training, agricultural economists, for example, don't receive training in poverty and welfare economics. It's a completely different train of work. So if you look, the action tracks themselves have over 400 people working every day. As Ajay said, none of us anticipated how much work this could possibly be, but you're working with a range of people you would never have worked with before. And so I think the kind of solutions that will come forward from the summit will be different to what we've had in any other development paradigm in the past. Because these issues of inclusion, how do we become serious about social inclusion, are starting to come up through the summit, through the voices of many groups who are raising their displeasure, perhaps at not having enough of a platform to be involved, but also of people who in their normal situation wouldn't have really considered these issues of inequality. And I think it provides, if we apply these kind of approaches to research in future, and we apply them to community development, for example, we have opportunities of shifting the game in the development world. So for example, I know, and Denisa, you've spoken something similar of local food security councils. Tambra mentioned them as well. But those are very much focused on the sector relating to agriculture and marginally nutrition. But now we see that this is far bigger. We have to talk about trade. We have to talk about food environments. We have to talk about the health system. There's so many other elements that have to be included when we take this broader framework of food systems. And so we can no longer talk about food security related only to agriculture. Food security is only one outcome of the whole food system. And so you see many different aspects coming into it. You see a very much more joined up approach and places for people to really take responsibility. And knowledge is power. And so when people start thinking and inquiring and being curious about more of these components as to what's exactly on your plate, what is in the supermarket shelf, I think we start to see things changing. And even already you can see the shift towards, there's some game changers being submitted on shifting the game in terms of what is funded for research. What kind of agricultural products should we be looking at? There's a lot more focus on the processing side and how processing can be helpful rather than harmful. So if you take, for example, some work that one of the team members in our action track has been doing, Will Masters, on just minimal processing. So just simple canning of tomatoes can relieve us of a huge burden of having to cook from raw products, and particularly in environments where women are extremely stressed. So urban environments where there really isn't much time to take a long time to cook. And some of those solutions are quite clever because they also reduce the cooking footprint. So the amount of energy and fuel required, particularly in low-income countries, like countries in Africa and in the East, where often we rely on coal for cooking. That is a huge environmental impact, and so much less if we're able to think about clever ways of solving some of these, particularly the burdensome elements in agriculture. So how do we lighten the load for men and for women, not in the field, but also particularly for women who generally take the responsibility for preparation in their homes? So I think the summit itself is a game changer. I think there are many very clever solutions. So first round solutions, there were 1,200 ideas submitted from a wide range of different people in society, showing the creativity and the deep thought going into how we can change the future and how we can shape the lives of people going forward.
Right. Wow. I love the willingness, right, of people and that creativity, and it's also that the people who provide funding are also very essential in making our creative thoughts and ideas, or even wild ideas, into play, or even in writing and research. I mean, you see as well from different labs coming in with meat, for example, that cut also emissions. And you spoke, I think everyone here spoke about the cooking aspect, and being, you cook at home. We're all, if you're not in quarantine, we're at home still. And it's that time, or those trade-offs perhaps, and just time and cost of what we have. And just one last question on that, on the processing that you mentioned, like making the food processed. Some might be a bit afraid, let's say, because it might be healthy or not. I mean, are those game-changing solutions with more research to make even women's time less at the kitchen, but doing more other productive things as well? Are those healthy too? Because we spoke a lot about health, non-communicable diseases. Are they putting that emphasis there?
No, for sure. I mean, there's some very creative ideas that are emerging in Africa and other parts of the world of pre-cooking indigenous products. So you're really not taking anything away except for the burdensome requirement for long cooking times. So there are many clever high temperature cooking techniques that can be used. Canning can be used, as long as you are following, the World Health Organization has just published new guidance, for example, on salt. So as long as you're not loading those products with salt and sugar, you can provide a very similar product to what you would at home, but that takes the burden of cooking out of it. So the problem comes when we are trying to attract consumers and we're actually changing the content. So I once had a student who did a fascinating study in South Africa of traditional foods, where people brought to a food fair the modern, traditional and highly processed versions of various traditional foods. So it was such an enlightening way of seeing how over time the ingredients have changed, mostly to satisfy our drive for sugar and fat, and sugar, salt and fat in these products. So if we're going to pander to consumer desires, yes, we are going to lead down the wrong path. Sorry, but I think we can keep it healthy.
Let's hope so. So I'm going to pass this over to Chef Kabui. On that note, on keeping it healthy. So this goes a bit more for the audience. This is going to maybe shift a bit, and we will also appreciate your open mind. Chef Kabui, do you have faith that we are going the right path in changing the food systems? And also, how can faith and religious communities and also organizations help create that change?
Mute. Yes, great question. I'm a big admirer. The best way and easiest way to answer the question is this. Two ways to answer the question. One, indigenous ways, and then one, intellectual way, which is two things I hope I can say I possess or wish to possess. Let's start with the indigenous way. The indigenous way is according to the worldview of my Kikuyu people. The past is present. We are always the past. And the past and the present dictates the future. So we also have the future with us. I'll give you a very rapid anthropological explanation of our worldview through how we name our children or how our names come about. In my culture, we don't have any new names. The new names are the old names that are just recycled, right? So my first two sons traditionally would be named after their grandparents. The first two daughters after their, the first two daughters and the first two sons would be named after their grandparents. All the other children after that would be named after the brothers and the sisters of the parents. You know, in the West, that'd be their aunties and their uncles. What that essentially means, if you can follow me, is that there is no separate connection between my children and my parent or the people they are named after. They are all the same thing. So you're named John and you're named after your grandmother or your grandfather. There is no separate connection in our worldview. between the small John or John Jr. and the old John. They're all the same people. Now, that gives me the worldview that when I'm feeding my son, I'm also feeding my parents and my family. And when I'm feeding my son, I'm also feeding him, because when he has a son, he'll name us the son after me, so it'll be me. So in other words, you're three different people at the same time. So for me, I don't have a past, I don't have a present, I don't have a future. It's all with me. If you think that way, you'll realize that when I eat contaminated food, I'm not only contaminating myself, but I'm also contaminating my son. By doing that, so I'm also contaminating my father. So that if you take that worldview, you have a very, very different outlook on life. You have a very different outlook on faith. What faith do I need if I am everything I have there is to be? Everything is me. So faith is what I do. There is no faith. In my worldview, there is no faith. It's only my action. There's only one action. That is the indigenous way of looking at the world. Now, let me tell you the intellectual way of answering your question. One of the people I really admire is the MIT professor, Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky gave one analysis that I found to be quite useful in answering the question. When asked about his analysis of the drug war, Noam Chomsky answered this way: if the government is successful in its effort to fight the drug war, the easiest way to look at that is to look at the prices of the drugs. The more successful the government is, the higher the price of the drugs will be. The less successful the government is in its fight for against the drug war, the lower the prices of the drugs will be. Why? Because we know the market is such that supply and demand is what determines the price. So if the prices are going down, and the drugs are easier and more accessible to people, that means the government is failing. So that's the way I'd answer your question, that we are not heading in the right direction because more corporations are becoming more powerful. They are getting more grounds. They're getting more control over our food, and more bad food is getting in the market more often. Corporations are coming up with ways of marketing food to our children now through technology, through apps on the phones, as a way of just pushing their market. So finally, to answer your question, to wrap up, is saying, what I, as a chef, as a Black person, as a person of goodwill, what I'm interested in to start this process is intent. The intent of the people who came to the Americas and conquered was to conquer, was to control, was to take whatever they could find, gold, land, foods from the indigenous people. That was the intent. Until we deal with that intent and we change the intent towards having a more just, equitable, and sustainable world, then we are going to have a system that's basically going to be dictated by those who have power.
Tremendous, Chef Kabui, and really lining what you said, that faith is a person, and we live through it. Over to you, Denisa. So how does faith come into play in all of this? And do you have faith as well that this will change, and your work taken into consideration with what now Chef Kabui said?
Thank you for the question. And as Indigenous people, as we see food is something that is holy to us. Food is something that that we seek much medicine from. And as we see our bodies as holy beings, it is very important to know that the connection that we have with our food and with our food system come from thousands of years of our food heritage and food practices that are based on prayers, that are based on what our ancestors initiated and started and created to be able to come this far. And # we are still here. And many of the foodways and many of the lifestyles that we're trying to reactivate regarding our ancestral wisdom and our ancestral practices is based on the spirituality. It is not something that we separate. It is not something that we say or we call as, religious organizations or religious groups. It is a way of life. And for us, being empowered by our prayers from our mothers and our grandmothers and from our families and what our youth are learning from our plant and animal relatives, that as we seek the solutions that they are found in prayers, many of the prophecies that our ancestors had regarding global climate change, regarding the things that we see at this point are happening. They're coming alive and true. And as Indigenous peoples, as we provide solutions and as we are in these conversations going forward, that prayer is really a part of how we go forward, how we move forward, and how we navigate solutions, and how we get visions. And this is something that is very special and sacred to us. And this is why it's so important as we get our voice heard, because it is that contaminated food that is also contaminating the prayers, contaminating many aspects of our food environments. And so for us, it is important, for me to speak on behalf of our Indigenous people, and those stories that are told and the stories that we hear from the creation stories, from, the food, how the food generated, and how, for example, our corn, and how we value so much the life of the corn, the resiliency of the corn, and the adaptability that it's gone through, that is so it's very, very powerful, and a spiritual walk for all of us as we navigate or re-navigate or even reactivate those life ways and food ways. And I do have faith that we can change for future generations. And it is because of our work going forward that it didn't start with us. It already started and has already started with our ancestors. So thank you.
Thank you, Denisa. Very, very inspiring, and really bringing that holiness of a sacred vision as well. Ajay, coming from India, where I've been numerous times, and there's just a lot of, as well, you feel the faith, the beliefs as well within the culture, and maybe perhaps a bit curious if that goes as well when growing food. So in that, how does faith and religion play a role in food? And keeping that in mind, do you have faith that this relation will maybe bring something more prosperous of what you mentioned before?
In in India, we have a saying in Hindi which goes as "Bhagwan Bharose," that everything depends on God and your faith. And and this goes out not just to India, it goes out to Africa, it goes out to all the developing countries, because what we find is that governments seem to have abdicated the responsibilities, and the record of most governments on antitrust laws, legal, regulatory framework, accountability, traceability is disappointing. And that is why we are left to depend on faith to take us along, to believe that there is a God and there is faith to take us forward. And especially in these precarious times of COVID, we look to God, we look to faith, and I really think that this is the opportunity for community, faith, and religious leaders to send the message out of equity and one health of the people and of the planet. And from India and from everywhere else, I can say on behalf of the producers that I have faith in the power of activism, where activists believe that their activism will change the world. And that is the faith, I think. So I have faith in to take us forward. I just want to leave it at that and say that there is faith, and this is it. This is the future, that we believe that activism will make governments work better. They will make governance improve, and these things will happen. But I just want to add two more points to what Denisa said and what Chef Kabui said, is that on food safety, on action track 1, what we were discussing on food safety, if you look at antimicrobial resistance, which is increasing world over because of how farming is happening. If you look at animal husbandry, 70% of the antibiotics are being used in industrial animal farming, and that it's not, humans are not taking antibiotics. 70% of them are going into animals, which we are consuming their products or we're consuming their meat. So this is a much, much bigger issue than what people realize it. And we need to get people like on this panel to talk about these issues, because people need to be made aware of food safety issues, of their health issues, and how everything connects to the planet or to themselves. Thank you so much.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Ajay. And want to learn Hindi, and also I want to learn Malayalam, but it's they say that it's a very difficult, the most difficult language. But so we're gonna go. Let's see, with Cheryl Tambra. I think I want to touch on Cheryl, because, or Tambra, you're already doing your activism, but I want to see what Cheryl you have to say. Also, when I ask a question about do you have faith, a lot of I regard it to trust too, right? Trusted, responsible leadership. And when we were talking before, in South Africa, for example, in numerous villages, there might be a house of worship or a church, but not necessarily a store to buy food or nutritious food as well. And Denisa was talking about food apartheid. So Cheryl, do you trust in the system now, that the actions that are being taken, and you've already answered a bit of this, that there is willingness, but how do you see that our community and our leaders are working together to reframe our food systems?
Muted. South Africa still has a long way to go. Our apartheid history meant that the geography was quite structured, particularly in order to manage potential uprisings of indigenous populations against the previous government. And so you find that many rural communities are by nature remote, but many of the people living in quite high density townships and informal settlements were sealed off from the city through a single road that led to the city. And so there was not very much spatial development that happened in those areas. So people have to travel quite considerable distances in order to access food. So as you mentioned, yeah, it might be the informal traders who are the only source of food in many of those communities. And they provide an amazing service. Even street food has a very important value in the lives of many people. But it does it does create and deepen the discrepancies and the inequalities, because people have to spend a large amount of their money. And so some of the solutions that we hear criticized in many conversations are sometimes actually the helpful solutions. So there's a lot against supermarketization of communities. But I'll give you one example of a community we worked with where the monthly social grant received from government was about 1,250 Rand. It cost that community 250 Rand just to get to a place to buy their staple food. So the relocation of, or the establishment of a supermarket in some of those more remote communities is actually a big saving, because a quarter of your income or a fifth of your income can now go into food rather than having to use it for transport. But of course, what's on the shelves of that supermarket is what we have to look at. And so we need more community involvement to make sure that those supermarkets are procuring from local producers, for example, that the kinds of foods that are in that supermarket fit with the local diets and support nutrition and local diets. Yeah, so, and there are many perverse techniques that supermarkets can use to get you to buy foods that you shouldn't be buying. So you very seldom will find that the staple foods are on a special or buy two for the price of one, but the foods that you wouldn't necessarily need are the ones on special. So I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. But I've dedicated my life to working on this topic. And so, yes, I do have the faith that we will change things, and that particularly the summit will make a difference.
I think I am seeing what you've mentioned, Cheryl, of involving more people and being more open, and that willingness. And I can just speak for myself as well, because I'm included there, and it's good to be taken into consideration. But it's also for let's say the elders to be also open that youth do have a voice, do have an understanding, and not because of being young and not so age experience. We are getting hammered with this. So yes, also for the youth representation, please take us into consideration. And for the audience, if you're here under, I don't know what you consider young, please do a shout out over there so we can clap and motivate you too. And Tambra, are you? Yes, Tambra. I would also like to expand the question that we have right now on your faith, but also faith in changing, because I really like the aspect of that you are called Big Wanda and food sheroes, and you talk a lot about the divine feminine. So that goes in line. If I hear divine, I hear something more like beyond me, and that I relate to a bit of faith or interfaith, the religious aspect. So how do you use that divine feminine to shift power in gender, for example, social inequalities, racial inequalities, cultural inequalities as well, to bring about that value in using everything from the land. So I'd love to get a grasp of that and including that faith perspective as well.
Thank you so much. I will answer from two parts. One, just being the Roman Catholic faith, even though that the Catholic Church has called out racism and recognized its shortcomings, it has played a critical role when we think about the use of colonial empires to colonize countries and communities and cultures around the world. And so it doesn't miss me from the idea that the church and UNFAO, they're all sitting within Rome. And so I think there is a great opportunity to take advantage of the role that institutional power plays into this, as well those who are the Catholic faith in local communities. And so within my own parish, years ago, I created a culinary ministry with a focus and a mission of putting our faith where our fork is. And that went on under the Obama administration with the Let's Move Faith and Communities initiative, brought together those of Protestant faith, Catholic faith, and Islamic faiths together around how do we play a critical role as local faith leaders of recognizing that many of us have tons of real estate, and it's an opportunity where you can grow food at your local parishes and churches and mosques and worship centers. And also it's more than just simply praying for ending these food wars, but how do we put it into practice? So within scripture, we talk about faith without works is dead. And so that's why for me, that activism is driven by this contemplative prayer of understanding that this is ministry work that I'm engaged in. This is building a movement of truly aligning my faith with my fork is. And how does that align with Wanda and the work of tapping in this feminine power from a divine perspective? It comes from recognizing that in this patriarchal society that has built up the role of dominant culture, is that for those of us of not only women, but also of Indigenous culture, that we truly must have a significant power for the world sectorial forces to go against us. And so it took time for me in tapping within and really communing with my God of understanding that I truly must be powerful for the world to be so against me. And it's through that mindset that I began to see who is mostly hungry in the world. It's women and girls, and who also runs the household and make food choices and are the first foods for our countries and community. It's women. And so with that, it became critical that what I deemed as my weakness truly became my superpower. And it's really unlocking that potential of seeing women in our villages, in our communities, to give voice and amplify and share that your vulnerability is your superpower. That is where your strength resides. And if we keep our eye on the prize, on the vision, we will be victorious when we get to the mountaintop. And we must bring other women along in this journey, because when we each one teach one and reach one, that's when we begin to create the change we truly want to see.
I love it, Tambra. Thank you so much. And that weakness is our superpower, and definitely, I think we've all got that. That we're here as well. And this, I need to take a moment to take it all in as well. And I love to have that energy transferred to Chef Kabui, that you mentioned a lot about eclectic health, eclectic nutrition, eclectic literacy. Can you tell us a bit more that in 2 minutes, how you, for example, being eclectic, you might be considered a bit, or someone might be considered a bit different, or like a stranger from the mainstream. So how can that, I don't say it's a weakness, no, but it's you stand out, right? So how do you take that into food activism? That we mentioned that activism is a way of doing it, and if we can have that answer in 1 or 2 minutes, that would be awesome. Can you open your microphone, please?
Good day. Thank you. Yes. First of all, let me just answer a question. Somebody asked me, my fellow, about the quote, the person I quoted, about few are guilty, but we are all responsible. That's a quote I made earlier when I first made my initial remarks. And the person who said that is Joshua Abraham Heschel. Joshua Abraham Heschel. He was a Jewish intellectual who was an advisor. So back to my question, what does eclectic mean? It's interesting that you started with the idea of eclectic. Eclectic simply means deriving ideas, style, or taste from a broad and diverse range of sources. That's exactly what we have right here. And that is essentially what is wrong with our food system. We have just a few people who have, basically not really a few, when you go back to it, it's just a handful, if not one source. It's just a few forces that determine how our food system looks. So once you take the financiers and the corporations and their governments, the governments are being influenced by the lobbyists, who are the corporations, and the corporations that are financed by the bankers. So the bankers, basically, the capital is really driving everything. That's what Marx talked about. So just a handful of people are determining our taste, which is what eclectic means. You don't want to have just a taste for one thing. So the best way is to become eclectic and have action-based faith, as my sister Tambra said. Faith without works is dead. And I doubt that there's any indigenous group of people anywhere who would claim a faith that is nearly as inactive as we have in our modern days. We have so many people who have faith, but obviously if things are bad, then it means that a lot of the faith that most people claim is not active. Because if you have active faith, then you have action globally. So I think that's where eclectic comes. So I take full responsibility and I try to use eclectic means. I'm farming, I'm making social commentary, I'm learning, ever learning to find out how other people are thinking about what issues are happening in India, because we are essentially one. I finish by saying that if we are having 4.5 billion pounds of glyphosate based Roundup being sprayed on crops every year, 4.5 billion tons it doesn't matter what I believe or I don't believe, that eventually is taking away from the health environment that I and our future is going to inherit. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Chef Kabui. And with that, I think I would love to get an insight from Ajay in your writings. You mentioned moving from food security to nutritional self-reliance. How can we better grasp that in our understanding, and also for the audience to take that nutritional self-reliance part as well? You can open your mic.
Sorry for that. I have already answered half of that when I talked about backyard poultry, kitchen gardens, because that's what gets us nutrition, it gets us traditional food, it gets our culture to remain alive. But I would want to use this opportunity to take forward what Chef Kabui has said about big businesses. And that's also a part of nutrition, because what you find is a greater consolidation of power and money in FRAT. FRAT is what I term as food, retail, agriculture, and technology companies. They control everything. And going ahead, as we go ahead in the years ahead, we will find that in each sector, there'll be tremendous power on the majority of the organized food consumption, supply, and production by a few companies, that we will see and buy what is on the shelf, what they decide. And so they will decide what we eat. And where I'm coming to is that farmers grow what consumers demand or government incentivizes. We do not grow what we want. And who decides what consumers eat is exactly what Action Track 2 on food consumption is about, and exactly what the issues of the power structures of the food systems are about. And that goes to the heart of this issue that needs to be resolved and needs to be raised at such moments and all moments that come ahead. Take for example, I'll just take half a minute more. So many international conferences take place on food, but rarely ever will you find a practicing farmer as a speaker or a panelist. Rarely ever. It's always academicians who are talking about food and food systems. Similarly, I think the other great danger that we're seeing is individual donors and philanthropists are putting in money, influencing policies on food in the developing world. I don't have a problem with that, but the problem I have is that the institutions in the developing world are not good enough to take a rational decision based on the influence that is coming on to them. So these are things that I think need to be completely understood and digested.
Right. And also there's a question from the chat. Maybe we can have Denisa and Cheryl as well to take in these final comments. What are your perspectives on corporate influences in the UN Food Systems Summit and resistance from indigenous and peasant groups that are boycotting due to a lack of emphasis on agroecology, human rights, and food sovereignty in the summit or in general?
That's for me? Or who do you
No,
want
that is for Denisa and Cheryl.
Okay, fine.
Thank you for that question. I did read that in the chat. It is very complex right now. We know that there are counter events to the summit. We know that there are groups and organizations, and also I represent one of those organizations too, as an Indigenous Council of Slow Food International, and also being a food systems champion, that Indigenous people are put on the line, are put to choose or to contend with, with what is happening. And my role in my perspective as a steward of biodiversity and biocultural diversity is to ensure that I can create opportunities for my people to speak out. And so I've been holding dialogues, independent dialogues, and working on more dialogues to unite the voice and also to be a contributor to to what is being discussed and what is being debated, and also what is not being represented in the value of creating, and also creating the space for the narratives, the true narratives, and the true lived experiences as Indigenous peoples. And so this is going to be an onward fight. And I think that as we are engaged in these conversations, that there is not going to, at one moment, going to be a unified movement. This is, something that we see as a continuous threat, or even risk, or even actions that are happening. But I think, for my role is that those that want to participate, I am willing and openly ready to help, facilitate that, because the voice of our ancestors, the voice of grandma and grandpa, and what the trauma that we experience, especially through the pandemic, needs to be heard. And so that is my comment to that question, but I'm happy to engage more. Please visit our website, because we are contributing more to that discussion and also the contention of it. Thank you.
Yes, if you can put on the chat as well, where the audience can follow you, that would be fantastic. And maybe Cheryl, on that, we discussed as well the hidden information in food. On that note, on that question, there was also another one that we can relate, is how does a plant-based diet versus carnivore diet come into the discussion? And just in 1 minute, please, how do we regain then control of the food that we put in our body?
I think we need to be exceptionally aware. As I pointed out to you in our earlier conversation, the longer the list of ingredients, the less you understand about what's in it, and the more harmful it is to you. So I think we need to get more savvy as consumers, because every dollar that we spend counts, and we're sending market signals by what we purchase. So yeah, I think that the label is there, but whether we're able to understand it and interpret it and what it means for our health is quite important. So I think we need a lot more in consumer literacy, but we also need a lot more like the guidance that the WHO has been issuing on salt content to try and regulate some of those components. Thanks, Bibi.
No, thank you, Cheryl. And Tambra, we will finish with you. What will be your call to action for the audience and for the people who you serve, and all the people beyond the audience, of what you have heard today from our fellow panelists, using your imagination, that collaborative spirit and creativity? What would be that call to action to move forward in making these food systems, or even food, more accessible, more equitable, into your perspective?
Thank you so much. We have a saying within the field of nutrition that if nutrition is your passion, then policy is your business. And I think for those who know intimately this issue and working with their communities, it is really our duty, our calling, to be able to amplify the voices of the voiceless and of vulnerable people, and to be in rooms and platforms. And I simply say, not have a seat at the table. If you can, create the table factory. Because at some point, we must recognize we perpetuate this illusion of what supremacy should look like. And it really is us, those of the Global South, Indigenous people, that truly have the power, that have the land to feed the world. And if it wasn't the case, there would be no colonial invasions. And so when I think about the Global Nutrition Report and how they have touched on equity, I want to just leave with a few thoughts of how we can reimagine what I say in Little Wanda's world, where food is power, where we amplify the voices of those who are nutritionally divested, that we balance the macro to the micro when it comes to nutrition policy, that we invest in inclusive health and nutrition workforce, that we embed nutrition equity metrics into a performance model, that it is a business, is not just a philanthropic approach, and that we measure and humanize the data from an intersectional equitable lens, and that we ensure the universal access to coverage of these services in nutrition and the social determinants of nutrition are covered, from the community support systems to the education to the healthcare, and that we provide equitable funding and resources for these nutritionally divested communities to co-create an inclusive and nutritious food system from their children's classrooms to our communities and clinics. And lastly, that we require this necessity of training on food systems and nutrition equity annually to our practitioners, and to decolonize our curricula, our practice, and our policies across food and health systems that integrate and address these inequities in our communities.
Thank you so much, Tambra. This has been an eye-opener dialogue. It has been for me. I hope that for the audience and also the other panelists to get to know more about the different perspectives and the different actors as well, that beyond just food systems is our way of life. It's our time in this world to make it worthwhile for everyone. So I really want to appreciate all of you here, and it's just fantastic. And we have reached our time, and so happy to hand it over to Andrew, our wonderful convener here. What a fantastic session, and I hope we can all keep together a conversation going on, and also doing those actions, right, and keeping on those commitments. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you to each of the panelists, to everyone who was in the audience participating, asking questions. I think this is, I think when we put these together, this was the conversation that we were hoping to have, of bringing together a diversity of perspectives that look at the food system within the truths that people occupy, and to bring the fullness of our bodies and our spirits and our minds to this, because that's what it requires. It requires a full self interaction in conversation and calling out what needs to be said. And so I want to thank you all for doing that in your own ways. We're a few minutes over time, and I want to respect the fact that other people have to go to bed or have to get back to their actual work days. So thank you again for being here. Please keep a lookout. If you go to faithandfood.earth, you can find our other panels. We've got 4 more. They're going to be every Thursday for the next 4 Thursdays. We would love to have you here to participate and grow and be engaged. Summits and panels and dialogues and conferences are one thing, but the true power is, how do we keep this moving? And so that is something that we're also committed to doing. So if you want to be more engaged, if you want to keep this conversation going, if you want to get more involved, please reach out to us. We would love to hear from you. And to each of the panelists, I hope that we continue to find ways to work together going forward. There's a richness and a depth here that has a real power to grow and move and change. So thank you again to everyone. We'll call good here, wave our goodbyes, and wish you all the best of days. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.